Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mary. I used to be strictly a fiction reader, but something has happened to me recently. Out of all the books I've read this year so far, I'd say a quarter of them are nonfiction, and the majority of these are historical nonfiction. I don't know how it happened. I'm a history lover, but I would get my fix through podcasts and video essays and, of course, Wikipedia rabbit holes. But now I'm a history book person, and I owe that all to one genre, the travelogue. In this video, I'm going to explain why I think the travelogue is a good gateway drug if you want to get into history books, a little history of the travelogue itself, along with 3 recommendations to get you started. Enjoy. So why travelogues? Well, let me air my grievances with conventional history books first. What do you think of first when you think of a history book? Probably a textbook from high school that you had to drag yourself through to read, or something that looks a little bit like this. Dense, heavy, filled with academic language, maybe a bit repetitive or confusing, when the actual history is anything but. No hate if you like these kind of books because they're published for a reason, and as I read more and more kind of historical nonfiction, I feel myself gravitating towards books the size of my head, which in the past I wouldn't have, so they're there for a reason. But for the newcomer to the genre, this might be a little bit inaccessible and even intimidating, which is sad because history is like one of the coolest things on earth. Enter the travelogue. The first travelogue was written sometime in the 1st century CE by Arrian of Nicomedia. It predates the birth of the novel by 1600 years, so suck on that, Robinson Crusoe. Personally, I view the travelogue as a really interesting blend of narrative storytelling and historical nonfiction, which I believe makes it the perfect bridge for people who want to read historical fiction, but who are primarily fiction readers. Travelogues are narrative simply because they follow the narrator's journey through their travels. This is different than a historian going on a sabbatical, because you get to interact through the text with the writer's thoughts, feelings, emotions, as they encounter new places, new cultures, new experiences, everything like that. It injects this really narrative feel into the history of the book. Travelogues are also uniquely historical because the traveler gets to witness history as it compounds and unfolds in front of them. It's a bountiful genre because of history's passing. A travelogue written in Russia in 1991 is going to have a very different context and meaning versus a travelogue written in Russia in 2021. Because of this, you get a much more intimate perspective of history since you're viewing it through someone else's eyes. Because of that unique perspective presented to you by the traveler, you get to see what parts of history jump out at you as they are recounted to you. And it gives you kind of jumping off points to explore different events, places, people, languages that you want to learn more about. Travelogues also have a shorter page count, meaning they're going to give you a bird's eye view of a region's history. This leaves you wanting more and wanting to explore that region and its history, so much so that you might pick up another book on the subject. In my opinion, a good travelogue author is someone who is interested in how history touches and shapes their travels, rather than how their travels touch and shape them as an individual. If you guessed I'm not an Eat, Pray, Love fan, you would be guessing correctly. My advice for picking a travelogue is pick a region of the world that you really want to visit or someplace that you know absolutely nothing about, and then check if Ryszard Kapuscinski has written a book about it. Write down the people, places, and events that interest you most, or God forbid, take a look at the index, and use that, again, as a jumping off point to start some reading in the historical nonfiction genre. Alright, here are my recommendations. This is Balkan Ghosts by Robert Kaplan. It was originally published in 1993, and it skyrocketed to popularity after President Bill Clinton was seen holding it underneath his arm. Shortly afterwards, the Clinton administration decided not to intervene in an ongoing genocide in Bosnia during the Yugoslav Wars. In this book, Kaplan journeys throughout a region in southeastern Europe, the Balkans. He begins in Vienna and he travels through former Yugoslavia, current Romania, Bulgaria, and he ends in Greece. The Balkans are a part of the world that are kind of lost on our historical consciousness, and they're marred by really intense ethnic and religious tensions, which are the focus of Kaplan's work. Kaplan also focuses on the impact of the Ottoman Empire's occupation of southeastern Europe, which occurred from the 14th century up until the 20th century. The Balkans is a region in tension not because of its ethnic conflict, but also because of its unique position as sort of this barrier between the Eastern world and the Western world, and also the Eastern and the Western mind, as Kaplan argues. I encourage you to think critically about this book, and I think it's a book that is a really good foray into critical analysis because sometimes Kaplan's opinions are, without a doubt, Orientalist, and you can kind of tell that he has a little prejudice against Turkish people. Also, Kaplan's criteria for what makes a Western nation is incredibly narrow. It depends on a nation's geographic and political proximity to Germany, whether he can get a cup of coffee or not, and whether the women in the country shave their legs. So take what he writes with a grain of salt. I picked this book up because one of my historical interests is World War I, and the Balkans are the cradle of all the violence that precipitated World War I start, culminating in, obviously, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But I also picked it up because I did not know where Sarajevo was on a world map, and that made me feel a little silly. So I wanted to learn more about this region. Overwhelmingly, this book is a story of centuries-long ethnic conflict. Kaplan reveals to us the dirty secret of the Balkans, and that is each of these nations are ethnostates. The powers in this area of the world has systematically taken turns ethnically cleansing each other from these small swaths of land, and it's turned these ethnic conflicts into blood feuds and turned neighbor against neighbor, family against family, and town against town. This has created a political and social situation that feels like a tangled ball of yarn of just total hatred and gruesome, murderous ideology. Kaplan details the absolute worst of these ethnic conflicts and the true lows people sink to during these blood feuds. He focuses intentionally on the injustices committed against Jewish people in the Balkans. Fascists and communists alike held pogroms against Jewish people, some of which the atrocities are much worse what the Nazi regime committed. One especially harrowing story involves the legionnaires of Archangel Michael in Romania. Interestingly, Kaplan draws really intelligent lines between ethnic conflict in the Balkans and the modern-day Israeli-Palestine conflict. He talks about it in an almost prescient way, an ethnic conflict and conquest of land that eventually led to an all-out war. In the Balkans, this was the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the Kosovar War. The Balkans had war on their soil as recently as 2001, which is really hard to comprehend. Interspersed between this bloody history that Kaplan puts under a magnifying glass, he shows his real love for the region through his travels. Quaint train rides, Turkish coffee, pilgrimages to Orthodox Romanian monasteries hidden high in the Carpathian Mountains, their colors reflecting those of the Romanian flag. He shows the passion of Greek identity through its cinematic history. Throughout the book, you get a sense of the music of the region and the rhythm of everyday life. Beyond this violence, you see that this region of the world is inexplicably beautiful, and in some way you can understand the violent urge to protect it. Cool, green Transylvanian pines, the sparkling, wine-dark Aegean Sea that separates east from west, pastoral scenes intermittent with the most brutal and ongoing ethnic conflicts to plague the world. It tugs on your heart. I'd recommend this book if you have an interest in World War I, the machinations of ethnic conflict, and the Turkish presence in Europe. This book took the ember of my interest in Eastern European history and turned it up full throttle into a flame. So after this book, I immediately picked up Goodbye Eastern Europe by Jacob Mikanowski. That book is like kind of a quasi-travelogue, and it tells a really beautiful tapestry of the intermingling identities that exist in Eastern Europe. It's not a homogenous part of the world, and that's what I learned from Balkan Ghosts, and Mikanowski in that book just expands on that and really shows you just how colorful and interesting and ethnically and religiously diverse Eastern Europe is. The next two books I'm going to recommend are by the Polish author Ryszard Kapuscinski, and I already said this guy's name once, and I'm going to say it like 7 more times, so Polish people, if I'm saying it wrong, I'm sorry. If you want to read travelogue, start with Kapuscinski. He's like Polish Indiana Jones. He's got to be one of the coolest people I've ever read about. He was Poland's first foreign correspondent in sub-Saharan Africa. He's visited the most war-torn and unstable places on the globe at their most war-torn and unstable. He witnessed 27 military coups and revolutions. He's been arrested over 40 times. He was sentenced to death 4 times. In this book, he wrestles a cobra. He's like better than Indiana Jones because he doesn't have the fear of snakes. Kapuscinski is an amazing writer, and he makes a lasting impression on the reader because he got his start as a poet and as a photographer. So there's a very artistic quality. He blends the genre of narrative fiction and reporting to create something new, something that is totally his own. He's come under fire at the end of his career for embellishing and not being 100% truthful, but to me he can lie all he wants because he's an incredibly awesome writer, and I think he's lived the most interesting life on the globe. The Shadow of the Sun details Ryszard Kapuscinski's time specifically in one of the most transformative time in Pan-African history, the decolonial movement. Kapuscinski is on the ground in Accra, Zanzibar, in Dar es Salaam during various independence movements in Africa. He sees these coups happen in real time. Kapuscinski is an incredibly humanizing writer. There is not a moment where the African people feel fetishized or generalized. He connects with people in the villages and towns that he's living in, and he gets a really interesting and thorough portrait of what life is like for an African. When the Western world is fiercely holding on to its former colonies and still hoping to exploit Africa's natural resources, Kapuscinski's voice is a clear ringing bell telling people the horrors and the impact of colonial ideology in Africa. He pulls no blows recounting the impact of slavery on the continent, describing swaths of Africa as desolate and fallow because of the slave trade's legacy. Kapuscinski's passion was the Third World, and this book is the perfect example of that. It is a humanizing, thorough, well-written account at the birth of a new era for Africa as it shrugs off, not without struggle, the legacy of colonialism. I want to read you just a brief little paragraph from The Shadow in the Sun because I want you to get a sense that Kapuscinski is not writing to report. He's writing to enthrall. He's writing to put you squarely in this world and make you understand the beauty of this continent that we have significantly injured and handicapped. In this passage, Kapuscinski is driving through the Serengeti. We drove onto the enormous plain of the Serengeti, the largest concentration of wild animals on Earth. Everywhere you look, huge herds of zebras, antelopes, buffaloes, giraffes, and all of them are grazing, frisking, frolicking, galloping. Right by the side of the road, motionless lions, a bit farther, a group of elephants, and farther still, on the horizon, a leopard running in huge bounds. It's all improbable, incredible, as if one were witnessing the birth of the world, that precise moment when the earth and the sky already exist, as do water, plants, and wild animals, but not yet Adam and Eve. It is this world, barely born, that the world without mankind, and hence also without sin, that one can imagine one is seeing here. Alright, we were on the Serengeti, but now we are heading to cold, cold Siberia with Kapuscinski's Imperium. This is Kapuscinski's account, starting in 1939, of the rise and the fall of the Soviet Union. Kapuscinski is Polish. He was born in eastern Poland in a little town called Pinsk. In modern-day Europe, that is a part of Belarus, and because of that, Kapuscinski was witness to the Soviet occupation of this town. He saw close friends and even his elementary school teacher disappeared to Soviet work camps in Siberia. 50 years later, he decides to cross Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railway and visit the most uninhabited and unexplored parts of the USSR. Along with Siberia, he goes to the Central Asian republics of the USSR, which not a lot of people know were part of the USSR. So he visits Georgia, he visits Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, a lot of stands, which he calls Soviet Stan. This book is awesome at illustrating the kind of negative, come what may, attitude of Russians in the Soviet Union, of being, after being propagandized and lied to their entire life and met with kind of unyielding, bludgeoning bureaucracy where if you don't follow it to a T exactly or participate too heavily, you're at risk of losing your life and your total autonomy. Kapuscinski talks a lot about the phrases employed by Russians to kind of excuse this demagoguery or bureaucracy, such as, well, that's life, or you can't fuck the whole world. Kapuscinski focuses specifically on the country of Armenia and its legacy and history. Armenia is one of the oldest countries on the earth, but you don't hear about it a lot because there's been a systematic campaign from essentially the beginning of history to erase Armenia off the map. And do not tell the Turkish government I said that. He talks about Armenia as a transient nation, and Kapuscinski's incredibly poetic and emotional writing is really well suited to this book because of his own personal experience as a victim of the violence of the USSR. He especially feels for Armenians, and he creates this really intense and vivid portrait of Armenian people and Armenian culture, kind of surrounded on all sides by enemies who are desperately trying to preserve their religion, their culture, their way of life, hiding books and tomes of Armenian Bibles throughout the generations, stained with the blood of people who were trying to protect them. Something Kapuscinski is really good at illustrating is how the USSR buckled under its own weight. That's one of the reasons the USSR dissolved, is that it couldn't hold itself up after the loosening of restrictions in the country, perestroika. And reading this as an American reader was really interesting because Kapuscinski lays out the buckling of the USSR in a way that just interests me as an American in this point in time in American history. He talks about the limitlessness of Russia. It has negative influence on its inhabitants' way of thinking, for it does not demand of them concentration, tension, an intensification of energy, or the creation of a dynamic, vigorous culture. Everything falls apart, is diluted, drowned in this ungraspable formlessness, which sounds a little bit familiar. He also talks about the impact of dictators in Russia. All dictators, irrespective of epoch or country, have one common trait. They know everything, are experts on everything. I just want to talk a little bit more about Kapuscinski's language and how it crosses the boundaries of narrative fiction because he plays this really interesting dynamic against each other of the Siberian plains and these really vivid, colorful portraits of the Soviet republics, especially the Caucasus. The way Kapuscinski writes it is just literary. He's foiling these two regions against each other, and the lines between travelogue and narrative and epic kind of blend and blur because of that choice. Kapuscinski makes you feel every single bone-chilling ice crystal of the Siberian plain and then balms that cold with the beauty and the resiliency of the Caucasus and the Central Asian republics in the face of intense repression by the USSR. This travelogue is just amazing, and I hope to God one day I get a chance to visit all these places in my life. All right, that's my spiel about travelogues. I really, really encourage you to start with these kind of books if you have any interest of getting more into historical nonfiction. It was really a genre of book that I thought I wouldn't dip my toes into, and the first of these books that I picked up was Balkan Ghosts, and I'm so glad that I did because it's really opened a whole new door in, my reading journey, for lack of a better term. Alright, thanks for giving this video a watch, and if you like my content, give this video a like and make sure to subscribe. Bye!